My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply, you will have to pay a tariff.
That's the deal the newly reinstalled president of the US, Donald Trump, offered to politicians and CEOs at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We will discuss what this new world means at home and abroad on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Vicki in the studio.
And it's James here too.
Welcome to you all. Right, obviously the big news, Chris, the re-arrival of Donald Trump to the White House has the sort of the dust of the moving vans in Washington settled in Westminster now.
No, I don't think it has really. Because I mean,
so it started actually.
No,
really.
exactly. Because even though, you know, we've heard this record before, it's still a complete change of tone, isn't it? And language and the nature of how politics is done and readjusting, recalibrating to how he communicates. And then that very visible and theatric action that he was seeking to demonstrate from day one. And it's just, you know, he has made a thing out of approaching politics very unconventionally. We've had 4 years where that hasn't been happening in at least the day-to-day sense. Obviously, there's been all the legal stuff and all the rest of it. And now we're back into it. And I think, you know, America's adjusting, Westminster's adjusting, the world's adjusting.
And Vicki, it's just, we just live in the moment, I think, don't we? Because sometimes you have to take a step back and think, hang on, the guests at the inauguration, so they're in the room. Well, from Britain, it was Boris Johnson. And the people who'd gone to watch it in a hotel are people like Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, Lawrence Fox, who's like a free speech advocate now. And the person who can phone Donald Trump whenever he wants is Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
That's quite a weird set of affairs considering like the special relationship.
Yeah. And the thing is, it does completely sort of skew that relationship and then throw into that Elon Musk, who seems to have a personal vendetta against Sir Keir Starmer. You know, that makes it incredibly difficult as well. And I just remember thinking, you know, when you talk about diplomacy, you talk about having a diplomatic correspondent, and then you think about Donald Trump. I mean, he's the absolute antithesis of that, isn't he? I mean, he doesn't do diplomacy. And to me, it just was a man in a hurry, wasn't it? This is a guy who's done his 4 years, obviously didn't achieve everything he wanted to, got slung out, and now he's back and he is determined to take action. And I think that is the interesting thing when you listen to some of the reform MPs and they're going, look what he's managing to do. He's doing all this stuff that we want to do here.
In a presidential system.
In a presidential system. They're just glossing over that bit. But, you know, that is the absolute sort of contrast, isn't it? And it's just about how on earth do governments, not just our government, how do people deal with him?
So let's cross to our undiplomatic correspondent. You've been branded for the next 4 years, James. In terms of the first moves that Donald Trump has done on the world stage, like what are the ones that in that history will judge as the really important ones this week, do you reckon? No pressure.
Well, look, I think, you know, domestically, what he does with immigration is going to be hugely significant, simply because he has to succeed on that. Otherwise, his people will turn on him. You know, he's not somebody who's seeking re-election, obviously, but that is something he has to achieve. That is where all his focus is, primarily domestically at the moment. It's about, you know, he's deploying people, he's establishing emergencies, you know, the army's being sent, and anything that he tangible that he can do, he's trying. Yeah. You know, the big question is, will all of this work? And I think that is the question mark that sort of underlines all of this initial flurry of activities. It's great and easy to sign pieces of paper and executive orders. It's much harder to actually make that work. None of this involves money, because if involving money involves decisions by Congress that will take a bit more time. And there are fundamental tensions within the whole Team Trump project between, you know, the business deregulation camp and the sort of MAGA Fortress America camp. And those will become I think, more visible as this presidency goes on. So, but at the moment, we're still in that. Do you remember Alistair Campbell used to talk about when people started going off Tony Blair in the sort of late 90s? He said, we're at the post-euphoria pre-delivery moment. I think we're in the euphoria moment and pre-delivery moment. And so, it's the initial throat clearing. But the contrast is with Trump 1. Slow burn, took time, learning. This time he's out the blocks immediately with 4 years of thinking going into this.
Although as we're recording this, we got the first sort of like bump in the road, which is a judge in Seattle saying, oh, actually, the executive order stopping the birthright citizenship, as it's called. So basically, if you were born on American soil, you automatically get to be American, regardless of your parents' immigration status. This judge has said, oh, actually, that might be against the Constitution, so maybe we'll just have to pause that. So actually, reality is starting to bite. Chris, do we know about the status of Lord Mandelson, our man in Washington, TBC?
Well, he'll be out there pretty soon and getting underway. And, he's had to face up to a few noises off, hasn't he, in the last week about the enthusiasm otherwise of the new White House team for him. The viewing government here is just the man for the job because he understands power, and he found what platform but Fox News to write a piece a couple of days ago in which he was doing as he will need to do, which is be diplomatic and make connections and try and build bridges between a left-leaning British government and a Trump administration, with some making noises that, is he the kind of guy that Donald Trump's going to want to do business with? And then entirely unhelpfully and undiplomatically, Nigel Farage saying, well, you know where I am, give me a call, I can help, etc., etc. But yeah, he'll be out there shortly as we await what we expect to happen relatively soon, but there's no word of it yet, of a invitation for the Prime Minister to go out and see the President in the coming weeks-ish. And obviously be a lot read into the kind of order of those kind of visits. But then it's all about, can the two kind of get on and achieve stuff? Can Keir Starmer manage to strike up something of a relationship and a rapport? I mean, in character terms, they could not be more different. Yeah. Although somebody did say to me the other day, well, actually, Theresa May and Donald Trump, maybe that was an even greater kind of character distinction.
Well, because remember, she won the race to be the first leader to go and see him last time, and it didn't do her any good at all.
No, but then beyond that, can a relationship be built where there can be transactions that Donald Trump is willing to entertain because he thinks they're in his interests, and can also be in the British interest?
Although I was maybe a bit unfair to Theresa May there, because doesn't she and her team say in their various books that they've written about that period that when she went to Washington and they had that famous hand-holding down the ramp moment, she actually got a commitment from him at the podium at the press conference to stick with NATO, because they'd actually been wobbling quite a lot the day before, and so actually they think that they did get something out of going to see him quite early.
Yeah, and it's all about how you deal with him, isn't it? And it is a lot about how seriously do you take what he says as opposed to what he does. And that's what you hear from a lot of British politicians. It's like, well, just don't get carried away with those tweets, in the same way as the media have to deal with this. The first time round, he was tweeting every morning, wasn't he? And it'd be like, right, how do we assess this? How do you get a reaction to it? And I think they feel the same, is that just you've got to almost like try and put that to one side, away from that noise, and actually look at what he does rather than what he says.
By the way, utterly incidentally, I once got...
right up our street.
Yeah, no, exactly. On one of the trips that I did following a Prime Minister to Washington, I got to walk up said ramp that you were talking about, that President Trump and Theresa May had walked down when there was the grabbing of the arm. And it's not particularly steep.
You can do it unaided.
I know that is noticeable when you're watching it on the television as well. But in all of the little sort of, micro insights you get when you get to step, it's a real privilege to get to step into that building and walk around.
What is the Oval Office like? Is it smaller than it looks on TV, cliche alert?
No, in a funny sort of way, it isn't. Have you been in there, James? Yeah, because
he's just too modest to say.
Really left
because on the
been.
TV you only see the sort of second, half of the oval, because when you go in for the sprays, as American journalists call them, where the two leaders are sat there in the chairs, and then all the journalists pile in, and then the two say something, and then there's a sort of barrage of questions that they can choose to ignore because they'll all shout at the same time, or choose to pick out one or two should they see fit. We did manage to once get a question to President Biden and Keir Starmer about the football, because England had been playing just a few minutes before, and they did actually engage with that. But yeah, you only see the second.
Did you say soccer?
No, I did. Well, the way it worked was Chris Hope of GB News asked the president about the soccer, and then I asked the Prime Minister, "Is it coming home?" And they engaged with that before they then did their sort of, pre-arranged niceties in front of us, and then you get bundled out.
2020.
Is football coming home, Prime Minister?
It looks like it.
But the room is actually sort of twice the size of what you see on the telly. So my impression was it was a bit bigger than I imagined it to be.
Let's listen to Donald Trump, one of the things he's been saying, and this is about defence spending amongst other NATO countries.
I'm also going to ask all NATO nations to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is what it should have been years ago. It was only at 2%, and most nations didn't pay until I came along. I insisted that they pay, and they did, because the United States was really paying the difference at that time, and it was unfair to the United States.
Okay, we'll gloss over the inaccuracy there that there were NATO members paying 0% on defence. But James, what are some of the many, many consequences of that demand for 5% of national income on defence?
Well, first of all, 5% is a very, very unrealistic figure. The United States itself is only spending 3.3 something at the moment. The biggest spenders are the Poles, who are making an astonishing commitment, and they are at the moment spending north of 4%. To get to 5% would require, many, many billions of pounds on all fronts. So what's he doing? He's making a pitch, which is a familiar one. He made it throughout his first one, which is that Europe should do more. He believes the US is being ripped off. And that is an argument where he's made huge inroads, and the Europeans, a lot of them, accept that argument. But it's not, going to go to 5%. The key point about this is what it actually means for Ukraine in the long run, and whether or not European nations are willing to step up and actually increase. If you think about it, in this country, the government's committed to 2.5%, but it's very, very cautious about saying when it's going to do that.
Unspecified
And
date.
in my world, the people I speak to, they all say, look, 3% is a bare minimum. It's going to be 3.5%. Because they think that the government and the people do not realise that the scale of the threat from Russia, and that is going to force huge and difficult choices on any British government, because the money is tight. When governments talk about focusing on economic growth, it is not just about making sure there's more cash for schools and hospitals. It is because whoever is in government over the next 10 years is going to have to spend more on defence. And as we were discussing, recently, that argument is not really being made because it will involve trade-offs.
And Vicki, we got a little preview of what that world is like last week when the cost of government borrowing went up a bit, and it started a whole flurry of what sort of scale of tax rises or spending cuts is Rachel Reeves going to have to do just to deal with this little bit of extra debt interest that's appeared this week? The borrowing yields have gone back down again now, so that was just a bit of a flurry, but that's a foretaste of how tricky this stuff gets. Yeah,
and I think, she obviously has said she doesn't want to break her rules, and there's a pretty big moment coming up in March when it's almost like there's going to be a judgment on whether she is set to break those rules or not. And so the speculation is growing about, does she have to do some kind of announcement about how she might fill the hole that she might have? She has said she's not going to come back for more tax rises. So does that mean spending cuts? And then, of course, then that feeds into where is going to get hit, and that's when it becomes incredibly tricky for her with her own party, unless of course they find some growth.
And Chris, the growth has been... Are you just texting Rachel Reeves to find out what size the black hole is today? Growth is we've got another dash for growth from the government this week, because kind of every day a minister has come up with kind of another idea, whether it's another runway at Heathrow Airport, for example.
Yeah, so you're seeing the word growth feature in all sorts of government press releases, even ones where you think, I'm not sure this is even really about growth, but somehow that gets shoehorned in. So they're absolutely sort of doubling down on that as being the mission and how they will be defined, and then pulling whatever lever that they can, with the prospect that, yes, do they end up, after this argument about expansion of Heathrow that has gone on almost since the Wright brothers first got themselves.
When Newscast first started.
Yeah, exactly. Is back again, and yes, that is about an argument about finding levers of growth, but it's also about signalling intent, because I speak to other folk around the whole Heathrow debate as it circles yet again, like the planes waiting to land, and people will say, yes, but it will take ages before you would get any planes landing. Someone was saying to me, actually, some of the analysis that's been done around of this means that a lot of them would be transit flights, so it would be people who might not even come into the UK at all and would even pay air passenger duty, etc., etc. Lots of
which is good for Heathrow's growth and its profits, but not necessarily the GDP.
Completely. But then equally, and this goes back to the point that Vicki was making around Donald Trump. There is the beginnings of an argument you hear more often now around, have we managed collectively over a period of time under multiple parties of government get into a mindset where it is normal to constantly prevaricate, to have mechanisms that you might argue are mechanisms of a sophisticated democracy, like judicial reviews and consultations and all the rest of it.
Protecting
Royal
mutes and
Commission.
bans.
Yeah, exactly.
White papers, green papers.
Which mean things take time and which might end up kind of gold plating the status quo. So make the argument of some, as opposed to being willing to make big and bold decisions, which will be controversial and not everyone will like, and then crack on with them and then be judged at an election as to whether or not they are a good or a bad thing. And I think you're seeing a greater prominence around that debate, and I suspect that will be sharpened because people will be able to say whether they like or dislike the Donald Trump style of politics. And yes, some of it might be theatrical and encounter bumps in the road further down the track. That is a sort of demonstrable action relative to promises that were made versus a fear that perhaps there is that sense of stuff just not happening quickly.
But I think there's more of a consensus, isn't there, now, probably. I think we have reached a point, possibly, where maybe a lot of the public and the political parties recognise that. It's just become a sort of idea that not only lots of things don't work properly, but this idea that nothing happens quickly, and when it does happen, it's so over budget that it's bankrupting the country. I think I've got a stat.
And then house building and things like that.
I've got a stat. 58% of decisions on major infrastructure went to court. And so you can see that there's this sense, isn't there, that someone's got to just come in and get things done. Now, of course, that causes all sorts of problems politically. You are potentially riding roughshod over all sorts of people, all sorts of, they talked about ending the challenge culture of small pressure groups. But, a lot of Labour MPs came from small pressure groups.
Because the thing that was announced today was that you if you want to judicially review a planning application and take it to court, you can do that 3 times. And they're now going to reduce that to just once in a few cases.
You need to tell their London mayor.
Because he's already threatened to judicially review the Heathrow expansion.
He's against the Heathrow expansion, as are lots of Labour MPs in London. So you can see the tensions are all there. But maybe, instead of these projects being delayed by a year, sometimes 2 years through the courts, maybe this is the moment where that does start to change. But as you were saying, the slight issue for the government, which is we talk about, long-term decisions as opposed to short-termism, quite a lot of this might not help them in terms of, their own futures politically.
And
it takes so long.
This allows us, doesn't it, because it's just irresistible, to illustrate the longevity of the Heathrow debate with one of my favourite ever stories, which comes courtesy of James, that I've ever heard in terms of on the beat journalism.
Why don't we play it and then James can explain what was actually going on that day?
Oh, I don't know what's coming.
Oh, yes, you do.
Hello. I was going to ask you a question. Are you a voter? You are.
I'm not.
Are you not?
Well, I'm a voter in
you're
America.
in America. I just wondered whether you were a resident here or not. Of course, I recognise you, but we're
I'm just
from the
doing
BBC.
a pantomime.
Of course you are. Fantastic.
Richmond.
How's it going? When do you start?
It's great. We
is it great?
started. We end the 12th of January.
So are you living here temporarily?
Yeah, I am. Hard to commute.
Yeah.
When you do 2 shows a day.
You can't. Very
No.
hard. It's exhausting
But I
enough
will
as it is.
say we are as funny in January as we are in December.
Do you have a view on? There's a plan out today to potentially expand Heathrow, stick another runway there.
Now, let me ask you a question. Would that bring more people to the economy?
It'll bring more people to the economy, but more noise potentially to a place like this.
To Richmond.
Yeah.
Richmond is a lovely place. I watch the planes go every day. I hear nothing.
You're relaxed.
I am.
Happy days. Happy days.
It's brilliant, that.
Actually, it's sort of self-explanatory, isn't it? You bumped into the Fonz and he's in favour of Heathrow expansion. I wonder if he still is.
I feel I need to defend myself. Sorry. You know what it was the thing is, you got to. I was told, right, you're doing a piece of telly for the news. You've got to rush down to Richmond. You've got 10 minutes there on the ground. So you're rushing around, just gathering as many voices as you can for these things, wretched things we call Vox Pops. And where I was, it was just me and a camera. There was no producer. And so the pavement there was very narrow. So I wasn't really looking at the people I was interviewing. I was just making sure that the cameraman and I weren't run over. And so this bloke came up and he was like, and so I started interviewing like that, and suddenly I realised, yeah. So suddenly, and then I kind of thought, well, it's who it is. And so you heard what I said. And then I thought, oh, well, he's here, so he's got a right to a view. And to my eternal regret, instead, as you heard, I said, so you're relaxed. I should have said, so you're cool with it. But I failed to say that. Anyway, I rushed back to the office and was cutting the piece and. Was sitting there thinking, do I tell the editors or not? And actually, I didn't, because I knew that if I had told them, they would say, and then I met Mr. Henry Winkler, otherwise known as the Fonz, in the well-known TV show Happy. So what I did was the Vox Pops were just kind of sort of, well, some people hate a third runway, two voices, and then I said, just my linking line was. But for some, a third runway would be happy days. As you went there already. Anyway, I put it in. I have to say the editor of the 6 o'clock news was not entirely happy not to have been told about it in advance.
The Fonz was making an appearance.
But the absurd thing was that, of course, the outside world, particularly in the US, thought that I hadn't recognised him. And so I was on the front page of an awful lot of regional papers.
Viral as the person.
Well, no, but it wasn't really viral days. It was like on the front page of regional newspapers as the mad Brit who didn't know who the Fonz was.
Who's famous in my house, but not many others? Maris Shevkovich.
Oh, yeah.
So he's the EU's now trade commissioner, but in his previous job, he oversaw the UK-EU relationship and the operation of the free trade deal. He has been speaking to a friend of Newscast, BBC economics editor Faisal Islam, and he raised the prospect of the UK joining this pan-European customs arrangement.
They've ruled out rejoining or applying to rejoin a customs union, but there are other steps on the way. Things like the pan-European Mediterranean cumulation area. Could your side envisage that as a sort of stepping stone towards fewer customs regulations?
I think that it might be one of the ideas at the same time, and as we concluded also after these very strenuous negotiations of these 3 agreements, that even the best free trade agreement cannot simply replace participation in the single market. But we respected the choice. Yeah. We respect, of course, how the UK government approaches this, and this pan-European area is something we could consider. But I haven't heard it so precisely formulated from our UK counterparts.
That is happy days for me. It's known as diagonal cumulation. That's what that deal does. But we don't need to go into that. Interesting to hear Faisal negotiating on behalf of the British government. And that's quite a good idea, actually. But then it got hosed down by the government quite quickly. Although not completely hosed down.
No, it was sort of, not
at this time.
Not at this time. Oh, actually, we don't think it crosses our red lines as far as not rejoining the customs union again. And it reminded me of a conversation I was having with a European source where they were kicking around this whole business of a youth mobility scheme, but desperate to make sure that in any description of it they didn't use the words freedom or movement. And therefore, and of course, we await to see, beyond this desire for a quote-unquote reset, what the government's really willing to do as far as changing, if it wants to, the relationship with the EU within the quite strict confines that it set itself, and whether something like this, which doesn't include the word customs in it, but kind of amounts to that, might be something they could entertain.
Allow me to explain.
Yes. Would it mean following rules?
Well, it would have. Well, I mean, all kind of agreements have a certain amount of following rules, and then a governance mechanism if those rules are broken, which in this case wouldn't be the European Court of Justice. But it's about this thing. It's this phrase, diagonal cumulation. So basically, if I run a company in the UK and I take in components and ingredients from other countries and then sell my products to the EU makes a judgment about, are there so many foreign ingredients in my product? It's actually not really a British product, and so therefore it should be taxed as if it's a foreign product made up of foreign components. This PEM convention is a whole load of countries where they all just pretend everyone's ingredients are the same. And so actually it means you get better tax treatment in terms of imports based on the ingredients and the components in your product.
It sounds like a perfect fudge.
I mean, that would. I mean, if there was a referendum on that, how would you put that on a bus? you need a bendy bus.
Yeah,
really long one.
And of course, underneath all of this is growth, and that kind of desire for growth, but within the political confines the government is setting itself.
And also what's interesting is that very boring description I just gave you of that convention. Actually, what the UK government actually is asking for, which is a veterinary agreement, which is to help with food and animal standards. That's actually not much more exciting than what I just explained, is it? So maybe if people are looking for something a bit more inspiring, and you can see why people like former Remainers like the idea of a youth mobility scheme, because it feels like a hopeful, optimistic thing, rather than more tweaks to bits of paper.
The government's got to weigh up, the accusation that you're watering down and ignoring the Brexit vote, and you're trying to somehow rejoin through the back door. Which is why boring
things politically are good.
Yeah, so people are not being rude about Faisal in any way, or in fact your description. But I mean, that's not going to catch people's attention, is it?
And that's maybe what they want, though.
Sorry, James.
No, I was just going to say, the thing is, you see, in my world, all of this is you said you wanted, it's not very exciting. I mean, it's seen as, this entire debate is utterly de minimis.
What does that mean?
It's small beer. In other words, veterinary agreements, youth mobility schemes, small little tweaks to a small little customs thing, which no one's heard of until today.
And 0.001% GDP.
The point is, if suddenly there's a trade war between the United States and the EU, right?
The UK has to choose.
The risk of us getting caught in the crossfire is huge, and that's going to have a far greater impact on our economic situation. And so the UK is going to face a choice. And at the moment, the government is, probably strategically quite rightly saying there is no choice and we're not going to be forced to make a choice. But at some point, it might be that the UK has to work out, how does it carve itself out from some of these things? Does it carve itself out from what the Americans are doing, or does it carve itself out from some of the EU retaliation that catches the UK? And that will involve some really, really tough choices. And the question is, what does that force the UK to do when it comes to its relationship to the European Union? And those things will make huge impacts on the politics of this. And so, in other words, that debate is not going to be about, the micro stuff. It's going to be about the big stuff, plus the broader argument, which is, what is the UK and Europe actually going to do about making its economy more productive, deregulating, spending more on defence in a cumulative way that it's forced to do? That's the big ticket stuff.
And actually, it's big ticket stuff that that can potentially happen very quickly in reaction to events, as opposed to a long, drawn-out treaty drawing up negotiation process, which can take years and years.
And we'll get the beginnings of a sense of that in the coming weeks, because the Prime Minister's going to Brussels relatively soon, and probably not long after we'll head to Washington. And so the beginnings of that kind of posture, and particularly if in the intervening period we get a greater sense of what the new president's going to do on tariffs, of how the Prime Minister squares those circles.
Right, we've run out of time. Thank you all for being so faithful to Newscast. That was a Traitors reference. If you
okay.
Thanks very much for being with us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.